This is the story about how I bought a Mini with my dad at only 16. Now this seems a pretty stupid thing to do. 16 years old, I couldn't drive, I didn't have a license, but me and my dad decided to take a pretty big risk. We were looking on eBay one day, looking at Minis. My dad had an affinity with them, grew up with them around and in his life. He'd had about 6 or 7. These had been from an 8-port right through to a Mark 1 Cooper S. He'd had a variety of Minis. So when I was growing up and I got to a certain age, I really fell into all things automotive. Now that came from, obviously, as I said, a Nick Cage film, right through to Goodwood Festival of Speed, where I first kind of saw these supercars running up and down the road, but also then going back to when I was a baby and I sat in my dad's best friend's 964 Turbo and really just had an affinity with brands, with the cars, and with motorsport. So following on from that, over the years, my affinity for brands and cars just grew and grew and grew. And this is when I found myself looking on eBay, trawling eBay, as we all do. I'm on Facebook Marketplace, I'm on eBay, I'm on Auto Trader, looking out for these cars that are almost too good to be true and hoping that one of them's out there to be kind of snatched up. So trawling through all these sites like we all do, we came across something that was just a little bit out of the ordinary. Now this was a palm green Mini, which I'd never heard of the colour before because the UK didn't get this colour. It had stripes, it had bucket seats, it had mini lights, wheels from factory, and it also had no ridge in the bonnet. Now this came back as kind of a complete anomaly. It's a car that almost shouldn't exist in the UK, and that's because it wasn't from the UK. It was from South Africa. In fact, you could get these in South Africa and New Zealand in similar specs, and they were almost a parts bin. What would happen was the manufacturing would take place for certain parts in the UK. They were shipped over and then certain parts were then added in the country of manufacture. And the reason for that was something to do with tax. So these cars ended up being kind of unicorns, so to speak. It kind of opens up the question, why did we end up buying one in the UK? Well, this comes from quite an elaborate man, quite an interesting man that we met in the purchase process. This car had come up on eBay, UK eBay, and it wasn't doing very well. It was really low bids up to the last day. I think it was on about £3,000 coming up to the last day. Now for a Mark II Cooper S, that's pretty unheard of. So we kept on watching the bidding. The bidding went on into the evening, and just as the bidding was about to finish, we put in our final bid, and when we did, the auction froze. We lost the car. Someone won it by, I think it was something like £50. So going back to school the next day, thinking kind of, you know, we've lost out, it didn't happen. We then had a message from the seller saying that the person who'd put in that last bid had pulled out and the car was still available. So we went in with a bid of, I think it was £7,400, which at the time was maybe half of what a Mini Cooper S was worth, a Mark II, and he accepted. The only thing we didn't realise at this time was he lived in Germany, he lived in Hamburg. So here we started on this kind of Top Gear journey, me and my dad going over to pick up this car that we've bought at auction that could have been fake, going over, flying over with loads of cables and battery tenders and, you know, a sat nav in our luggage, and we set off to drive home. So we flew into Hamburg Airport, where we were met by the individual. This was the first time we'd ever met him. He was a really lovely guy who'd obviously loved his cars. He then started talking and we realised he was a real character and loved all things automotive. He said that what he used to do every year was he'd fly over to South Africa because he had family there. He would purchase a car every single time and he built up a collection. But what had happened this year was he went over and bought one more and his wife said, no, this is it. We don't have enough space. You need to get rid of something. And that's when he put the Cooper S up, reluctantly. So we bought this car. He gave us all the package and kind of the history of the car, all in this bag. We had different things, different stickers, all stuck over these books telling us of why this car was unique and why it was the way it was. That then kind of made sense when we looked at the different quirks of the car, exterior door hinges, the Austin Mark 1 logos on the car when it was a Mark II, and the bucket seats. So we were able to then start putting everything together. We then left him in the airport, realising that we'd taken the bag of the documents, we'd given him the money for the car, gone to the toilet and realised that he still had the keys. So we'd left the guy with the keys to his car. He could have ran off, but he didn't. He was a really nice guy. So after we'd grabbed the keys from him, we set off from Hamburg Airport. And the idea was to drive over to one of the ports. It wasn't Calais, it was further north. And then we were going to get the ferry, which on kind of the time zones looked like it was only a 2-hour crossing. This is where we messed up. We didn't realise it wasn't a 2-hour crossing, it was a 14-hour crossing, and we were travelling through the night. The issue is what we'd told my mother and my dad had told his wife was that we were going to be home by the next evening. And that wasn't just where the problems stopped. On that drive from Hamburg Airport to the ferry, we had some serious issues with the car. It was almost like chitty chitty bang bang. It was knocking like mad. The car was constantly banging. It was the most juddery ride and the issue with this when we got to the other side was we found out that it was actually that the choke was forced open. We managed to get to the ferry with about 10 minutes to spare. We'd blown the baffles out the exhaust because of how rough the car was running, and we managed to get on that ferry. So we set off on this ferry, obviously thinking it was going to be only 2 hours. It ended up being 14. My mother was there waiting for us that evening, and we had no signal. So we had no way to tell her that we'd messed up and that the ferry crossing was longer. Unbeknownst to us, that evening, there had been another ferry doing the same crossing that had hit unfortunate winds and waves and actually had sunk. So there's us in the middle of the ocean with awful weather, a sunk ferry, and no way to contact my mum to tell her that we are absolutely fine. So she's thinking the worst. She's got on the news that a ferry has gone down and we aren't able to be contacted. So she had probably one of the most frightening evenings of her night, and we're here trying to sleep on one of the roughest ferries we've ever been on due to the waves. After landing back on UK soil, we then took the Mini off the ferry, and this is where we had more issues again. We managed to ground out on the ramp, we took out the exhaust mounts, and then we were dragging our exhaust, like dragging our tail back into the UK. So we had to find a garage quick, and luckily we found a local garage that was able to sort out our exhaust and get us running. They managed to realise that it was a choke issue. So we travelled on down the road, we started making our way home, and then all of a sudden, bang, the car stopped. So we managed to just about wean it into a services where we were able to then ring the RAC. Now, one of the key issues with the RAC that we didn't know at the time was that the RAC only covers you on your trip if you start from the UK, go to Europe and come back. Obviously, we picked the car up in Europe and drove it back. So our coverage was null and void when we were in Europe. We only realised that later when we got home. So the RAC arrived. Now this opened up kind of another can of worms. We expected obviously that they would just put it straight on a trailer. They instantly wanted to test the car. It was pretty funny when quite a young guy turns up with an OBD2 scanner, tries to plug it in and then realises it's a 1960s Mini and he can't do anything. So we managed to get it on a truck and we got home. About 48 hours later, one exhaust blown and a broken car. But it's all a history, it's all a story. And then one of the coolest things that came of it is when we got home and we were looking through this bag of documentation, we actually found keys for an Aston Martin DB5, which we had to send back to the owner. So I guess in some way, we started off by leaving the keys with him, and at the end, it swung in roundabouts, and he'd ended up leaving keys with us that he didn't know he'd lost. So that's the story of my Mini Cooper S, which I sold reluctantly last year for the only thing that I sold myself I would ever sell it for. And that was my Ferrari 360. So hopefully you get a little idea of the journey that I've been on, the experiences that we've had, and hopefully you'll be able to understand the fact that there's a lot of cars out there that people just don't understand, and they can be those potential cars that make you money, but also give you these journeys and these stories with loved ones, family, friends, and just for having fun. Thank you for watching. If you could like and subscribe, it would mean the world. And we're going to go on, show you my journey, and hopefully add some more cars to the collection.